There is a kind of half-assed liberal idea that while colonialism wasn't great, at least Britain gave India the trains. And maybe that's something they should be thankful for. After all, trains are pretty useful, especially in the 7th largest country on Earth. So, colonialism, maybe not all that bad? Unfortunately, Britain also stole $45 trillion from India, all the while exploiting religious divisions between the Hindu and Muslim communities and further turning them against each other. And those beloved railways, they became the sites of mass slaughter while Britain sat back and watched. Empires of Dirt, a show about Europeans getting rich at the expense of everyone else. Britain first got involved in India through the East India Company, which had its headquarters right here on Leadenhall Street. A private company owned by London stockholders, the East India Company grew over the next 300 years to become a quasi-governmental body with its own army and laws responsible for trading spices, cotton, silk, and tea all over the world. By 1858, ownership of the East India Company had been transferred to Queen Victoria after the failed Indian Rebellion. Trains were the brainchild of British engineers. The East India Company would use railways to transport exploited resources like cotton and coal more efficiently around India. And it worked. Between 1853 and 1924, a railway network was created to help Britain extract from India relentlessly. And it's not like we gave India the railways either, by the way. We made India pay for them, and we ripped them off in the process. Despite Indian mechanics having their own efficient, cheap designs, Britain made India buy trains from them. Between 1854 and 1947, over 14,000 locomotives were imported from the UK to India. Initially, Indians weren't even allowed to work on the trains. They were staffed entirely by white people, from the board directors to the ticket collectors. The railways made little profit, but British shareholders who invested in its construction made vast returns, guaranteed at the expense of Indian taxpayers who had to pay for it. India's railways were basically like someone burgling your house, building a ramp to wheel all your stuff out, sending you a bill for that ramp, and expecting a round of applause at the end of it. Now that the railways were built, Britain could get down to the task at hand, squeezing India for every last ounce of profit. They were really good at it. In the 1600s, when the East India Company was established, Britain accounted for less than 2% of the world's GDP, while India accounted for almost a quarter of it. By the 18th century, Britain had become one of the most powerful empires in the world, while the prosperity of the Mughal Empire was fading fast. Britain relentlessly squeezed India for every last bit of resource for its own uses. In 1943, up to 4 million Bengalis starved to death, partly because their food was diverted towards British soldiers during World War II. Winston Churchill said the famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. After it was no longer profitable to remain in India, and after receiving huge pressure from the Indian independence movement, the British finally left in 1947. Before they went, they split the country into two: Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, in an act that became known as partition. But in their haste to get out of the country, British diplomats arranged a shoddy partition agreement that ignored the fact there would be interreligious conflict. Cyril Radcliffe, the British lawyer assigned to draw the borders of Pakistan and India, was given 40 days to do it. After partition, millions of Muslims trekked to Pakistan and what is now known as Bangladesh, while Indians and Sikhs headed the other way. Violence between Pakistan and India ensued. Within a year of the British leaving, 15 million people were displaced, and between 1 and 2 million people were dead. Trains became the sites for mass murder during the migration. Trains filled with refugees crossing the border on each side were stopped, and everyone on board was murdered. Women were captured and raped. Carriages were set on fire with petrol, with people still inside. The only ones spared were the drivers, so they could transport their trains full of dead bodies to the final destination. The British knew about the train massacres, but they'd already washed their hands clean of India. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, writing to Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India in 1947, said, "Keep India united if you can. If not, save something from the wreck. In any case, get Britain out." Despite all this, the 4 million starved to death, the careless partition, the $45 trillion they stole from the Indian people, many don't think that the British did anything wrong in India. A YouGov poll in 2014 found that 59% of respondents thought the British Empire was something to be proud of, and only 19% were ashamed of its misdeeds. Trains, cricket, empire. What could possibly be wrong with that?
The Queen, her gold carriage alone is made of 4 tons of solid gold, worth over $370 billion at today's gold prices. The Bank of England Nominees Limited was established to hide the Queen's investments. Secrecy about her wealth protects her. Government and banking officials inform the Queen about where to invest her wealth. That's called insider trading, and it's illegal. But the Queen gets away with it scot-free. Why? Because she's the Queen, and she's immune to prosecution. The Queen owns more than 300 residences, including castles and palaces, crown jewels, over 27,000 masterpieces, prize racehorses, and a fleet of Bentleys and Rolls-Royces. Her colossal wealth also includes crown land and investments that she inherited from her black nobility ancestors. The Queen's Crown estate includes over 50% of the UK's coastline, as well as Regent Street and Windsor Great Park. Her trillions in wealth are passed down to her descendants, untaxed. Would British tourism collapse if the monarchy was abolished? No, statistically, Buckingham Palace doesn't even make the top 20 list of tourist attractions.
Do you know how much the Queen is worth? 17 trillion pounds. That's $30 trillion. She could end world hunger and poverty tomorrow.
Besides insider trading and tax-free income, the slave trade and drug trade. Queen Elizabeth I started the British slave trade in 1564. As head of the Church of England, her slave trading of African blacks upset the moral foundations of the Church. Queen Elizabeth II is now head of the Church of England. 200 years after the slave trade was abolished, the Church was pressured into confessing its horrific crimes and apologizing for profiting from the African slave trade. At first, the Queen and the Church only admitted to owning slaves and plantations, but the public soon discovered that the Church had given their blessing to something far worse. The Church had approved the beating, mutilation, rape, kidnapping, and murder of tens of millions of Africans by declaring that Africans had no soul. This gave the Church a divine license to profit from their diabolical crimes. Even more lucrative than Queen Elizabeth's slave trade was Queen Victoria's drug trade. Opium was grown and manufactured in the British-owned opium factories of British India. China banned the importation of opium, but once the British monarch secured a drug trade monopoly, over 17,000 illegal chests of opium worth millions were forced onto the Chinese population. The British waged 3 drug wars on China to force them to pay for the illegally imported opium. China's emperor didn't stand a chance against the British East India Company gunboats and Royal Navy. The British destroyed, plundered, looted, and raped their way along the coast of China until there was nothing left to loot or plunder. On August 29, 1842, the Treaty of Nanking forced the Chinese government to pay £15 million to the British merchants to open up its ports to opium trade and to cede Hong Kong to the British. This was the ugly origin of Hong Kong's 155 years as a stolen British Crown colony.
There are people who believe that they have a God-given right to rule over others. They believe that their outward appearance is superior to all others. They harbor selfish ambitions to be rich and to have power over what they describe as common people. They lie cheat, steal, strangle, stab and slash their way to power. They believe that their actual willpower, what the British occultist Aleister Crowley described as the will of Thelema, the royal will, must be obeyed. Literally millions of people have been slaughtered at the behest of the royal lust for war. And thousands of people have been assassinated so that demonic dukes and killer queens can reign supreme.
The highest award given to British officials who work abroad is the Order of St. Michael and St. George. This consists of a star with a little enamelled painting, and the painting shows the angel St. Michael standing on the neck of the devil, and the devil is a black man. This image is very similar to one that we've become familiar with. A policeman kneeling on George Floyd's neck as he says, "I can't breathe." And the idea of standing or kneeling on the neck of a black man is deeply embedded in these notions of dominance, of white people over black people, the dominance of Western nations over other countries. Now, one of the recipients of this award was a man called Sir Evelyn Baring. Sir Evelyn Baring was the grandfather of someone called Mary Wakefield. Mary Wakefield is the wife of Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's chief advisor, a man who has done more to cover up the record of current events than anyone else in this government. Sir Evelyn Baring was governor of Kenya when Kenya was a colonial possession of the United Kingdoms. And while he was there in the 1950s, he instituted a system of concentration camps, which even his own Attorney General compared to those run by the Nazis. He drove into these concentration camps and fortified villages. Almost the entire population of the Kikuyu people, then numbering over 1 million people. Huge numbers died, some of them of starvation and disease, many beaten to death, burnt to death, tortured to death. Repeatedly, men were castrated. In some camps, almost the entire population of children died.
And until the Mau Mau are destroyed, the innocent too must suffer.
It was Evelyn Baring who oversaw the creation of this system.
Sir Evelyn Baring, upon whom rests the main responsibility of the campaign.
We are making progress in that struggle, and we are all confident that in the end we will succeed.
He also directly authorised the beating to death of people within those camps. When Labour MPs asked inconvenient questions about this, on one particular occasion when 11 men were beaten to death, he told the Colonial Secretary to tell the MPs that they had died from drinking contaminated water. Before Britain left Kenya, there was an order sent down, implemented by Special Branch, to conduct what they called a thorough purge of the archives. They burnt crate after crate of documents. One of the orders instructed that if there were too many documents to burn, they should be packed into weighted crates, taken as far from the coast as practicable, and dumped into very deep water without currents. They erased not only the evidence of what happened in Kenya, but much of what happened in Malaya.
The British troops in Malaya, slowly but steadily, are smashing the Red's reign of terror, and they'll keep at it till the job's done.
In Yemen, where Britain fought its dirty war, in Aden.
We're going to be extremely firm and extremely mean. If anyone starts any trouble, they'll just get their head blown off. They'll get the message in time, you know.
We remember all this in the context of Boris Johnson telling us that to pull down statues is to lie about our history. The entire history that we are told about British imperialism is a lie. We, as a nation, have a greater level of pride in our empire than any other European nation. People look back with nostalgia to Britain's imperial past. That's impossible to understand unless we understand the massive fabric of lies, of deletions, which has airbrushed the colonial atrocities practiced everywhere we went. Imperialism has long been justified through the notion that the white man had a duty to civilize the so-called other races. Racism is an ideology. and to a very large extent it was created by British theorists. You can take it back to the late 18th century and the work of a physician called Charles White, who was one of the people who formalised this idea that there's a sort of ladder of life, and the white man is at the top of that ladder, and below the white man on the ladder is the white woman, and below that were people with dark skin. That ideology remains with us today. It's that ideology which led to the policeman kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, institutional racism, to systemic racism. And a huge part of that ideology began here in the United Kingdom to justify our seizure of other people's resources and other people's lives. These relationships continue by other means, through our trade relationships today, which are often highly coercive, enforced by offshore tribunals of corporate lawyers, basically forcing countries to give up their natural resources, enforced by international debt, and what we see is a net drain of wealth from the poor nations into the rich nations. This wealth is not just being taken from other people in the world today, it's also being taken from future generations. The capacity of the earth to support us is being wrecked by those who are burning through the earth's resources as quickly as possible, who are destroying our life support systems. Environmental destruction, imperialism, racism, these are intimately connected. They all mesh together as part of a global system of injustice. It's not just the bad stuff in history that they don't want us to see. It's also the good stuff. The massive role of the slave revolts and rebellions, of the slaves themselves and the ex-slaves, who through their advocacy managed to generate a huge amount of outrage about the slave trade and what it involved. Similarly, the history of resistance and rebellion within these shores, a huge range of people's movements amongst the working classes, amongst the middle classes, trying to create a better, juster, more democratic nation, often hundreds of years before their visions came to fruition. And by learning from that history, as well as by learning from our history of atrocities, these two hidden histories, we can begin to understand where we stand, why we are where we are, and how, from that position, we can start to build a better world. Double Down News brings the big issues together. It shows how they fit into the wider story, the story of where we are and how we got here, and the story of how we need to change, how we need to build a better world. So please support Double Down News through Patreon and allow this journalism to flourish.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming along this evening, and I would also like to extend my respects to my Gadigal brothers and sisters from my people, the Wiradjuri people. In the winter of 2015, Australia turned to face itself. It looked into its soul and it had to ask this question: who are we? What sort of country do we want to be? And this happened in a place that is most holy, most sacred to Australians. It happened in the sporting field, it happened on the football field. Suddenly the front page was on the back page, it was in the grandstands. Thousands of voices rose to hound an Indigenous man, a man who was told he was an Australian, a man who was told he was an Australian of the Year. And they hounded that man into submission. I can't speak for what lay in the hearts of the people who booed Adam Goodes, but I can tell you what we heard when we heard those boos. We heard a sound that was very familiar to us. We heard a howl. We heard a howl of humiliation that echoes across 2 centuries of dispossession, injustice, suffering, and survival. We heard the howl of the Australian dream, and it said to us again, "You're not welcome." The Australian dream. We sing of it and we recite it in verse. Australians all, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. My people die young in in this country. We die 10 years younger than average Australians, and we are far from free. We are fewer than 3% of the Australian population, and yet we are 25%, a quarter of those Australians, locked up in our prisons. And if you are a juvenile, it is worse, it is 50%. An Indigenous child is more likely to be locked up in prison than they are to finish high school. I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges. Reminds me that my people were killed on those plains. We were shot on those plains. Disease ravaged us on those plains. I come from those plains. I come from a people west of the Blue Mountains, the Wiradjuri people, where in the 1820s the soldiers and settlers waged a war of extermination against my people. Yes, a war of extermination. That was the language used at the time. Go to the Sydney Gazette and look it up and read about it. Martial law was declared and my people could be shot on sight. Those rugged mountain ranges, my people, women and children, were herded over those ranges to their deaths. The Australian dream. The Australian dream is rooted in racism. It is the very foundation of the dream. It is there at the birth of the nation. It is there in terra nullius, an empty land, a land for the taking. 60,000 years of occupation. A people who made the first seafaring journey in the history of mankind. A people of law, a people of lore, L-O-R-E, a people of music and art and dance and politics. None of it mattered because our rights were extinguished because we were not here according to British law. And when British people looked at us, they saw something subhuman, and if we were human at all, we occupied the lowest rung on civilization's ladder. We were fly-blown Stone Age savages, and that was the language that was used. Charles Dickens, the great writer of the age, when referring to the noble savage of which we were counted among, said it would be better that they be wiped off the face of the earth. Captain Arthur Phillip, a man of enlightenment, a man who was instructed to make peace with the so-called natives in a matter of years, was sending out raiding parties with the instruction, bring back the severed heads of the black troublemakers. They were smoothing the dying pillow. My people were rounded up and put on missions from where, if you escaped, you were hunted down, you were roped and tied and dragged back. And it happened here. It happened on the mission that my grandmother and my great-grandmother are from at Warringezda on the Darling Point at the Murrumbidgee River. Read about it. It happened. By 1901, when we became a nation, when we federated the colonies, we were nowhere. We're not in the Constitution, save for race provisions, which allowed for laws to be made that would take our children, that would invade our privacy, that would tell us who we could marry and tell us where we could live, the Australian dream. By 1963, the year of my birth, the dispossession was continuing. Police came at gunpoint, under cover of darkness, to Mapoon, an Aboriginal community in Queensland, and they ordered people from their homes, and they burned those homes to the ground, and they gave the land to a bauxite mining company, and today those people remember that as the night of the burning. In 1963, when I was born, I was counted among the flora and fauna, not among the citizens of this country. Now, you will hear things tonight, you will hear people say, but you've done well. Yes, I have. And I'm proud of it. And why have I done well? I've done well because of who has come before me. My father, who lost the tips of 3 fingers working in sawmills to put food on our table because he was denied an education. My grandfather, who served to fight wars for this country when he was not yet a citizen and came back to a segregated land where he couldn't even share a drink with his digger mates in the pub because he was black. My great-grandfather, who was jailed for speaking his language to his grandson, my father, jailed for it. My grandfather on my mother's side, who married a white woman who reached out to Australia, lived on the fringes of town until the police came, put a gun to his head, bulldozed his tin humpy, and ran over the graves of the 3 children he buried there. That's the Australian dream. I have succeeded in spite of the Australian dream, not because of it, and I have succeeded because of those people. You might hear tonight, but you have white blood in you. And if the white blood in me was here tonight, my grandmother, she would tell you of how she was turned away from a hospital giving birth to her first child because she was giving birth to the child of a black person. The Australian dream. We're better than this. I have seen the worst of the world as a reporter. I spent a decade in war zones from Iraq to Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are an extraordinary country. We are in so many respects the envy of the world. If I was sitting here where my friends are tonight, I would be arguing passionately for this country. But I stand here with my ancestors and the view looks very different from where I stand. The Australian dream. We have our heroes. Albert Namatjira painted the soul of this nation. Vincent Lingiari put his hand out for Gough Whitlam to pour the sand of his country through his fingers and say, "This is my country." Kathy Freeman lit the torch to the Olympic Games, but every time we are lured into the light, we are mugged by the darkness of this country's history. Of course racism is killing the Australian dream. It is self-evident that it's killing the Australian dream. But we are better than that. The people who stood up and supported Adam Goodes and said no more, they are better than that. The people who marched across the bridge for reconciliation, they are better than that. The people who supported Kevin Rudd when he said sorry to the stolen generations, they are better than that. My children and their non-Indigenous friends are better than that. My wife, who is non-Indigenous, is better than that. And one day I want to stand here and be able to say as proudly and sing as loudly as anyone else in this room, Australians all, let us rejoice. Thank you.
Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world.
Hold on. Who is Donald Trump to talk about the civilized world? He can't be referring to the country that has over 4,000 nuclear warheads, 800 military bases around the globe, and which has been at war for 222 years out of the 239 years in its history. A country whose legacy includes hundreds of years of slavery and mass genocide against indigenous populations. That's what passes as the civilized world? What is civilized about being the country with the highest rate of incarcerated people in the world? What is civilized about a society that spends trillions of dollars on war but can't provide shelter to 500,000 of its people? What is civilized about dumping toxic waste next to poor indigenous, brown, and black communities and then creating policies to discriminate against and police them? There is nothing civilized about kidnapping children from their parents, throwing them in cages, denying them medical care, and letting them die under the custody of a U.S. governmental institution. There is nothing civilized about a president instituting Muslim bans, surveilling communities, emboldening white supremacists, or inciting hate against vulnerable populations every single day online. Our uncivilized wars are connected to militarized racism, discrimination, and hate crimes we see here at home. The U.S. has long categorized populations as civilized or uncivilized, as the basis for invading countries and bombing cities. The uncivilized become expendable, worthy of death, and all too easily ignored. As prominent intellectual Edward Said once said, every single empire in its official discourse has said that it is not like all the others, that its circumstances are special, that it has a mission to enlighten, civilize, bring order and democracy, and that it uses force only as a last resort. For decades, people across the Middle East have been devastated by the U.S. ventures in the region. Through war, military occupations, propping up dictators, imposing sanctions, and fueling civil wars, the U.S. has done enough damage to create economic, environmental, and mental health crises that will last generations. As an Arab and Muslim person who grew up as part of the post-9/11 generation, I have seen throughout my entire life how U.S. imperialism, military occupation, and racial profiling has devastated families and communities at home and abroad. As a Palestinian who goes back and forth between the U.S. and Palestine, I have witnessed how my family in the West Bank has been directly impacted by a decades-long military occupation, an occupation that's sustained by more than $30 billion in U.S. taxpayer money. There is nothing civilized about depriving populations of their freedom. The World War III memes people were jokingly posting on Twitter are a reality for people across the region, from Syria to Yemen, from Palestine to Iraq, from Afghanistan and Iran to Pakistan. For those of us living across the U.S., it's on us to support and amplify the demands of millions of young people across the Middle East who are calling for freedom, justice, and self-determination. It's on us to take a staunch anti-war stance and protest all forms of militarism. And it's on us to organize, go out into the streets, and demand that the United States become part of the civilized world.